What does it mean when a war crosses an invisible line when the places once labeled safe begin to burn? In the dead of winter, apartment windows glow not with warmth, but with the blue light of phone screens recording explosions. Sirens echo where silence once ruled. People stand frozen, not just from the cold, but from disbelief. This was supposed to be the rear. This was supposed to be untouchable. Yet fire blooms in ports' power plants fall dark, and the geography of security collapses in real time. For years, the conflict followed an unspoken rule. Violence stayed over there across borders along front lines, drawn on maps and reinforced by television rhetoric. Cities deep inside Russia were portrayed as insulated green zones, far from danger, far from consequence. That illusion did not crack gradually. It shattered in a matter of hours. From the southern port city of Rostov-on-Don to the industrial heartlands hundreds of kilometers inland, Ukraine's latest wave of strikes redrew the war's boundaries. These were not symbolic pinpricks or propaganda gestures. They were calculated blows against infrastructure that defined Russia's sense of depth and safety. Fuel depots, power plants, chemical facilities, each target selected not for spectacle, but for effect. Rostov-on-Don was the first shock. Long considered the logistical backbone of operations towards southern Ukraine, the city had lived under the assumption that its distance from the front and its dense air defenses guaranteed protection. That belief died at the docks. A critical fuel tanker tied up in what should have been one of the safest harbors in the country was struck and sunk. The message was unmistakable: the war had reached Russia's arteries. As smoke still rose from the port, the strikes expanded north and east. Oryol, a regional hub southwest of Moscow, became the next proof point. Residents heard a sound unlike the buzzing drones they had grown accustomed to seeing in online clips from the front. This was sharper, faster, more alien. Moments later, the city's thermal power plant, the backbone of its heating and electricity, was hit with precision. Lights went out, heat vanished. In sub-zero temperatures, that absence became a weapon. Then came the deeper reach. Over 1,000 kilometers from active fighting, an industrial giant tied to global fertilizer markets erupted in flames. Roads closed. Production halted. What had been marketed as strategic depth was exposed as strategic fiction. Together, these strikes formed a single narrative thread. There is no longer a rear. The distinction between battlefield and homeland, between soldier and civilian space, dissolved overnight. Russian officials spoke of interceptions and minimized damage, but the lived reality told a different story. Cold apartments stalled factories, and a spreading realization that the state's promise of protection had failed. This was not just a military escalation, it was a psychological breach. When war arrives uninvited at kitchen tables and school closures replace morning routines, the contract between government and society begins to fray. And as winter tightened its grip, one question echoed louder than the explosions themselves. If the rear is gone, where does safety exist at all? If the first shock was geographic, the second was technical. These strikes were not random acts of reach. They were exercises in timing, engineering, and restraint. Ukraine did not simply hit targets, it waited. Each blow landed when vulnerability peaked, when damage would cascade beyond the immediate blast radius and resist rapid repair. At the port of Rostov-on-Don, the tanker that went down was not intercepted at sea or ambushed in transit. It was struck while stationary during loading operations when its systems were exposed and its mobility reduced to zero. This was not about sinking a ship for headlines. It was about neutralizing fuel at the moment it mattered most, when logistics depended on precision and continuity. A single hit to an engine room does more than immobilize steel. It silences pumps, disables firefighting systems, and turns containment into chaos. That same logic carried north. In Oryol, the target was not a random industrial facility, but the thermal power plant that kept an entire district alive during winter. 2 strikes followed in rapid sequence. The first, crippled generation. The second, severed distribution. This was a textbook double tap, not to maximize destruction, but to prevent recovery. Crews can repair turbines. They cannot restore power when transformers are destroyed and replacement components are scarce. The sounds captured by residents mattered. High-frequency, fast-moving impacts suggested a shift in Ukrainian capabilities. These were not slow propeller-driven systems, easily tracked by legacy air defenses. They flew low, fast, and quiet enough to compress reaction time to seconds. By the time alarms sounded, the damage was already done. Then came the strike deep in the Samara region. The facility targeted was among the world's largest ammonia producers, a pillar of fertilizer exports, and a critical source of hard currency. This was not not an emotional choice. It was economic warfare conducted with surgical intent. Fertilizer is not just an export, it is leverage. It underwrites budgets, sustains influence, and feeds wartime procurement when energy revenues tighten. When production halts, the impact ripples far beyond factory gates. What linked these attacks was discipline. There was no saturation bombing, no attempt to overwhelm civilian centers indiscriminately. The pattern was narrow, deliberate, and aimed at systems fuel, heat, cash flow. This was the equalization of pain not for revenge, but for deterrence. For years, Ukraine's cities endured rolling blackouts and frozen nights under missile fire. Now the same pressure was redirected inward. Russian authorities responded with familiar language. Dozens of drones intercepted damaged limited systems resilient, yet the visuals contradicted the statements. Burning industrial complexes, closed schools, and cities plunged into darkness. Numbers could be adjusted, temperatures could not. Strategically, the timing was as important as the targets. Winter magnifies infrastructure failure. A power outage in summer is an inconvenience. In winter, it becomes a humanitarian crisis within hours. Pipes freeze, buildings crack, recovery timelines stretch from days to months. Ukraine understood this calculus and acted accordingly. These strikes were not meant to win the war in a night. They were designed to force choices, to make every kilowatt, every liter of fuel, every air defense battery count. And as those choices narrowed, another question emerged far more dangerous than any missile. How many vulnerabilities can a system absorb before it begins to fold under its own weight? For years, Russian air defense was marketed as an iron dome, stretching from the front lines to the capital. Names like S-300, S-400, and Panzer were invoked as symbols of technological supremacy, proof that the homeland was shielded, layered, and untouchable. The events of these winter nights exposed how thin that shield had become. The failure was not absolute. Some drones were intercepted, some alarms worked. But modern air defense is not judged by what it stops. It is judged by what gets through. And what got through revealed a system strained beyond design limits. Fast, low-altitude munitions slipped beneath radar coverage, optimized for higher, slower threats. Reaction windows collapsed from minutes to seconds. Operators were forced to choose between targets, knowing that missing one could plunge a city into darkness. Geography turned from asset to liability. Russia's vastness, once celebrated as strategic depth, became an unsolvable equation. Defending every refinery, port, power plant, and chemical facility across thousands of kilometers is mathematically impossible. Air defense batteries are finite. Crews are finite. Missiles are finite. Every deployment to protect a city is a withdrawal from the front. This dilemma now sits at the heart of Moscow's war planning. Should defenses remain near armored units and command posts in occupied territories where losses directly affect battlefield outcomes, or should they be pulled back to protect civilian infrastructure and industrial lifelines essential to sustaining the war itself? The strikes forced that question into the open. The attack near Rostov carried particular symbolism. Explosions landed within walking distance of state security buildings, physical evidence that even the institutions tasked with internal control were no longer insulated. Authority relies on visibility. When protection fails in public view, confidence erodes faster than any supply line. Official statements attempted to restore order through numbers. Dozens of drones destroyed, threats neutralized. Yet numbers do not heat apartments. They do not restart factories. They do not erase videos uploaded by civilians watching flames rise where safety was promised. In the information age, perception is a battlefield, and this one was lost in real time. More revealing was what did not happen. Despite deep strikes against critical infrastructure, there was no uncontrolled escalation, no nuclear response, no sudden widening of the conflict beyond existing parameters. This challenged a long-standing assumption in Western capitals that striking deep inside Russia would trigger catastrophic retaliation. Instead, the response was measured constrained by reality rather than rhetoric. That restraint carried its own message. The tools available to Moscow were already committed elsewhere. Air defenses were stretched, strategic reserves were limited, choices had consequences, and every consequence now carried domestic weight. In military terms, this marked the collapse of the sanctuary concept. In psychological terms, it marks something deeper, the end of certainty. When citizens realize that protection is selective, not universal, trust becomes conditional. And when trust erodes, even the strongest systems begin to creak under pressure. The air defense myth was not destroyed by a single strike, but by repetition. Each successful penetration widened the cracks, turning confidence into doubt. The question no longer was whether Russia could stop everything it was, whether it could stop enough. And in a war measured by endurance, that distinction may decide far more than any single battle. When the power went out in Oriel, the darkness carried more than inconvenience. It carried cold. In Russia's residential architecture, heat is not an individual choice, but a centralized promise. Boilers feed entire districts through kilometers of pipes, and when that flow stops in winter, the damage begins almost immediately. Water freezes, metal expands, systems rupture from the inside out. What fails in hours takes months to repair. This is why the strike on the thermal power plant resonated far beyond its technical footprint. Tens of thousands of residents were left without electricity, and more critically without heating as temperatures plunged well below freezing. Schools closed not because of snowstorms, but because classrooms could not be kept warm. Officials spoke cautiously, minimizing language, but closures told the truth that statements could not. Energy warfare has long been part of this conflict, but it had followed a one-way direction. Ukrainian cities endured rolling blackouts, emergency generators, and nights lit by candles instead of streetlights. The objective was psychological exhaustion to turn civilian discomfort into political pressure. Now the vector reversed. The same tool was applied inward, and the effect was immediate. For ordinary families, geopolitics collapses into physical sensation. The hum of a radiator, the warmth of a child's room. When those disappear, abstract narratives lose meaning. No slogan explains frozen pipes. No televised briefing restores heat. The state's most basic obligation to protect life in winter comes under scrutiny. The closure of schools marked a turning point. Education systems are often the first to absorb shocks quietly, but they are also early indicators of systemic strain. In this case, the decision exposed a deeper failure. Authorities could not guarantee safe conditions for children. That reality cut through propaganda with brutal efficiency. The broader implication was unavoidable. If heating plants could be struck with such precision, then every centralized system became a potential pressure point. Water treatment, transportation hubs, industrial power grids. The question shifted from whether civilians would feel the war to how often and how deeply. Internationally, the pattern mirrored conflicts elsewhere. In Ukraine, energy infrastructure had been targeted to sap morale. In the Middle East, power and water facilities have long been instruments of leverage. In East Asia, planners openly debate the vulnerability of grids in a high-intensity conflict. The lesson is consistent: modern societies are only as resilient as their infrastructure. For Russia, the timing was particularly damaging. Winter amplifies dissatisfaction. Heating failures are not abstract statistics, they are lived crises. And when those crises originate not from natural disaster, but from military vulnerability, the narrative of strength erodes quickly. Officials attempted reassurance. Repairs were underway, systems were stabilizing, yet the physics of frozen infrastructure does not bend to optimism. Even brief outages can cause cascading failures that linger long after lights return. What unfolded in Oriel was not mass suffering on a catastrophic scale, but something more corrosive: uncertainty. If it happened here, could it happen elsewhere? If one plant could be knocked out, how many more were exposed? As the cold settled in, so did a realization once unthinkable that the war's costs were no longer confined to distant regions or televised battlefields. They had arrived in living rooms, and once that threshold is crossed, the balance between endurance and dissent begins to shift in unpredictable ways. The flames rising over the industrial complex in the Samara region carried a different kind of meaning. This was not about heat or darkness in homes. It was about money leverage and the arteries that kept the war economy alive. The target was an ammonia and fertilizer giant, one of the pillars Russia relied on to compensate for shrinking oil and gas revenues under sanctions. Fertilizer is not a secondary export, it is strategic currency. It feeds global agriculture, generates foreign exchange, and sustains political influence across food importing regions. When production halts, the impact is felt not just in balance sheets, but in shipping schedules, contracts, and long-term credibility. The strike shut down operations, sealed access roads, and sent toxic smoke into the sky, a visible signal that this revenue stream was no longer secure. At a time when energy income is constrained, losing even part of this sector matters. Wars are not funded by rhetoric, they are funded by cash flow. Every factory offline tightens procurement delays payments and forces trade-offs between military priorities. Ammunition production competes with infrastructure repair. Air defense resupply competes with social spending. These pressures accumulate quietly, then all at once. The logistical consequences extended back to Rostov. The sinking of a fuel tanker was not merely symbolic embarrassment for the Navy. Fuel is the invisible backbone of mechanized warfare. Armored units without fuel do not maneuver, resupply, or retreat. They become liabilities. The disruption at the port increased dependence on already vulnerable routes, concentrating risk onto fewer lines of supply. This narrowing of options creates fragility. A system built on redundancy can absorb shocks. A system forced into single-point dependencies cannot. Every delayed shipment compounds uncertainty along the front. Commanders plan with margins. Those margins were shrinking. From a strategic perspective, this was cumulative warfare. No single strike was decisive. Together, they formed a pattern of erosion cutting at export revenue, fuel logistics, and industrial confidence. The objective was not collapse overnight, but exhaustion over time. Globally, the approach echoes other conflicts. Ukraine itself has lived under economic pressure from infrastructure loss. In the Middle East, targeted strikes on energy and trade hubs have reshaped bargaining power. In potential US-China scenarios, analysts routinely model attacks on ports and manufacturing as levers of influence. The logic is universal. Modern power depends on uninterrupted systems. For Moscow, the strikes exposed a narrowing corridor. Protect the front or protect the economy. Shield soldiers or shield factories. Each choice weakens the other. And unlike rhetoric, economics does not negotiate. As winter deepened and export facilities smoldered, the question shifted from resilience to sustainability. How long can a war continue when the mechanisms that pay for it are increasingly vulnerable? And at what point does the cost of protection exceed the value of what remains to be protected? Beyond the burning ports and darkened cities, the most profound damage unfolded quietly inside living rooms, online forums, and the collective psychology of a society told it was safe. Security is not only enforced by weapons, it is sustained by belief. When that belief collapses, authority follows. The strikes did not trigger mass panic in the streets. There were no immediate protests, no visible unrest. What emerged instead was something more dangerous for any centralized system: doubt. Doubt about protection, doubt about priorities, doubt about the future. Videos filmed from apartment windows spread faster than official statements. Flames and sirens replaced reassurances. Reality bypassed censorship. The Kremlin's messaging struggled to adapt. Economic hardship was framed as a necessary sacrifice. Infrastructure failures were minimized. But narratives lose power when they contradict physical experience. No explanation resonates with a parent watching their child sleep in a cold room. No promise outweighs the sound of pipes cracking under ice. This moment marked the erosion of the invincibility myth. For years, the war was framed as distant, controlled, and manageable. The homeland was portrayed as insulated from consequence. These strikes punctured that narrative decisively. The war had crossed an emotional border. Psychologically, this is where endurance wars are decided, not on maps, but in kitchens, not through casualty figures, but through daily discomfort layered with uncertainty. When people begin to ask whether the state can fulfill its most basic obligations, legitimacy frays at the edges. International parallels are unavoidable. Ukraine experienced this pressure firsthand, so have societies in prolonged conflicts elsewhere where infrastructure became leverage and morale became terrain. Even in potential great power confrontations, whether in the Taiwan Strait or the Middle East, planners understand that civilian perception shapes strategic outcomes as much as battlefield success. For the United States, watching closely under President Donald Trump, the lesson cuts both ways. Strategic prestige rests not only on power projection, but on resilience at home and credibility abroad. Security and freedom exist in tension. Protecting one without undermining the other is the defining challenge of modern statecraft. As winter advances, the question facing Russia is no longer whether it can strike back, but whether it can reassure its own people. Can it restore the sense that tomorrow will be warmer, safer, and more predictable than today? And for the world watching, a broader question lingers when wars erase the boundary between front line and home front, between soldier and civilian space. What does victory even mean anymore? The winter strikes deep inside Russia marked a turning point not because of their scale, but because of their intent. By targeting fuel logistics, power generation, and export-driven industry, Ukraine shifted the war's center of gravity from the battlefield to the systems that sustain it. Ports once considered secure burned, power plants fell silent, factories critical to global markets halted. These attacks exposed the limits of Russian air defense, the fragility of centralized infrastructure, and the impossibility of protecting every asset across vast territory. More importantly, they shattered the psychological barrier separating war from daily life. When heating fails in winter, politics becomes personal. Strategically, the strikes forced painful trade-offs to fend the front, or the homeland soldiers or civilians' optics or economics. Globally, the pattern echoed conflicts from Ukraine to the Middle East and future great power scenarios where infrastructure and morale are decisive levers. At its core, this was a story about legitimacy. A state's power is measured not only by missiles, but by its ability to keep homes warm, cities running, and trust intact. As the cold deepens and uncertainty spreads, the outcome of this conflict may hinge less on territory gained than on belief sustained.